In 1950, Venezuela was the fourth richest country in the world per capita. Its capital, Caracas, gleamed with modern skyscrapers. Oil wealth had transformed this South American nation into a beacon of prosperity. Venezuelans enjoyed higher living standards than most Europeans. American corporations flocked to tap into the nation's vast petroleum reserves. The future looked limitless. Today, that same country is unrecognizable. Over 7 million people, nearly a quarter of the population, have fled. Hyperinflation reached over 1,000,000%. Hospitals lack basic medicine. Supermarket shelves sit empty. Children scavenge through garbage for food. What happened? How does one of the richest countries in South America descend into poverty in just 2 decades? This is not a story of sudden catastrophe. This is a story of structural fragility, political choices, and cascading failures, a cautionary tale about the dangers of putting all your eggs in one basket, especially when that basket is buried deep underground. To understand Venezuela's collapse, we must first understand Venezuela's blessing and curse: oil. Discovered in the early 20th century, Venezuela's oil reserves proved enormous. By the 1970s, the country was producing over 3 million barrels per day. When OPEC orchestrated oil price increases in the 1970s, Venezuela experienced a windfall. Money poured in. The government spent lavishly on infrastructure, education, and subsidies. But here's the problem. Venezuela built virtually its entire economy on a single commodity. By the early 2000s, approximately 95% of export revenue came from petroleum. The state oil company, PDVSA, didn't just extract oil, it funded the government itself. This created what economists call Dutch disease, when natural resource wealth causes other economic sectors to wither. Why invest in manufacturing when oil brings easy money? Why develop agriculture when you can import food with petrodollars? Venezuela's manufacturing sector shrank, its agricultural production declined. Industries that once thrived were abandoned. The country became a paradox, fabulously wealthy on paper, yet fundamentally fragile. Its prosperity was entirely dependent on global oil prices, a variable it could not control. Norway discovered oil around the same time. Norway also became wealthy, but Norway took a different path. It created a sovereign wealth fund, saved its oil revenues, invested in education and technology, and maintained diverse economic sectors. When oil prices fell, Norway's economy remained stable. Venezuela made the opposite choice. In 1999, Hugo Chávez became president. A former military officer, Chávez promised a Bolivarian revolution, a transformation that would lift Venezuela's poor and break the power of its elite. His timing was fortunate. Global oil prices began rising in the early 2000s and would eventually reach record highs. Between 2000 and 2013, Venezuela enjoyed an oil bonanza. Money flooded government coffers. Chávez spent it generously. He created missions, social programs that provided healthcare, education, housing, and food subsidies. Poverty rates fell dramatically. Millions received benefits they'd never had before. For Venezuela's poor, Chávez was a hero. But beneath the surface, structural problems were growing. Economic historians note that Chávez's model was fundamentally redistributive, not productive. He took oil wealth and distributed it to the people, which was politically popular. But he didn't build the economic foundation to sustain those programs once oil prices fell. He didn't diversify the economy. He didn't encourage private investment. He did the opposite. Industries were nationalized: electricity, telecommunications, steel, cement. Price controls were imposed on basic goods to keep them affordable. Currency controls were established to prevent capital flight. On the surface, these policies seemed to empower ordinary Venezuelans. In practice, they had devastating consequences. Price controls meant businesses often sold products at a loss. Many simply stopped producing. Domestic production collapsed. Supermarkets began experiencing shortages even during the boom years. Currency controls created multiple exchange rates, spawning massive corruption. If you had government connections, you could buy dollars at the official rate and sell them on the black market for enormous profits. Billions were siphoned out of the country through this scheme. Former Venezuelan economists explained that the country became more dependent on oil, not less. Imports exploded because Venezuela wasn't making anything domestically anymore. Everything, food, medicine, machinery, came from abroad, paid for with oil money. When the oil money stopped, everything stopped. And then there was PDVSA, the golden goose. Chávez transformed Venezuela's state oil company into a political instrument. After a strike by PDVSA workers in 2002-2003, Chávez fired nearly half the workforce, about 18,000 employees, including many skilled engineers and managers. Loyalty to the revolution became more important than technical expertise. PDVSA's revenues were diverted from reinvestment into social spending. Infrastructure decayed, maintenance was deferred, production techniques fell behind. Oil output, which had been around 3.2 million barrels per day in 1998, began a long, slow decline. When Chávez died in 2013, he left behind a country that looked prosperous but was actually hollowed out, an economy utterly dependent on high oil prices, with collapsing domestic production, crumbling infrastructure, and institutions weakened by politicization and corruption. It was a house of cards, and the wind was about to blow. In mid-2014, global oil prices crashed. A barrel of oil that sold for $110 in June 2014 fell to below $30 by early 2016. For Venezuela, this was catastrophic. Government revenue collapsed virtually overnight. The country had saved almost nothing during the boom years, no sovereign wealth fund, no rainy day reserves. Venezuela had spent everything and then some, confident that high oil prices were permanent. They weren't. Nicolás Maduro, Chávez's hand-picked successor, now led the country. He inherited an impossible situation, and his response made everything worse. Instead of cutting spending or implementing reforms, Maduro doubled down on Chávez's policies. The government kept subsidies flowing, kept state enterprises running, kept trying to maintain the social programs, but it had no money to pay for any of it. So it printed money. Lots of money. This is the mechanism of hyperinflation. When a government can't pay its bills through revenue, it prints currency. But printing money doesn't create wealth, it just dilutes the value of existing money. As more and more bolivars flooded the economy, each one became worth less and less. Price controls, still in place, created absurd contradictions. A loaf of bread might officially cost 10 bolivars, but there was no bread in stores because bakeries couldn't afford to produce it at that price. On the black market, that same loaf might cost 10,000 bolivars. Multiple exchange rates, official and black market, created chaos. The government said $1 equaled 10 bolivars. The street said $1 equaled 100,000 bolivars. This gap represented pure corruption. Those with access to official dollars could instantly multiply their wealth, while ordinary Venezuelans saw their savings evaporate. Venezuelan refugees recall how they worked as teachers and watched their monthly salaries become worthless. In 2018, a month's salary could buy maybe 2 kilograms of meat, then 1 kilogram, then none. People would get paid and the money would be worthless within a week. They weren't living, they were surviving day by day. By 2017, Venezuela was in full economic collapse. By 2018, it had entered hyperinflation, defined as inflation exceeding 50% per month. At its peak, Venezuela's annual inflation rate exceeded 1,000,000%. Think about what that means. A coffee that cost 100 bolivars in January might cost 100,000 bolivars by December. Workers were paid in stacks of cash so large they couldn't fit in wallets. ATMs became useless because the maximum withdrawal couldn't buy a piece of fruit. People weighed money instead of counting it. The bolivar became worthless. Many Venezuelans abandoned it entirely, using US dollars or Colombian pesos for transactions when they could get them. The entire society was unraveling. Food disappeared from stores, not because of natural disaster or war, because the economic system had broken down completely. Farmers couldn't afford to plant crops, truckers couldn't afford fuel, stores couldn't afford inventory. The food distribution system simply stopped functioning. Venezuelans lost on average 11 kilograms, 24 pounds during this period. Doctors called it the Maduro diet. Malnutrition soared. Diseases once eliminated, like malaria and diphtheria, returned. Hospitals ran out of medicine, surgical supplies, even basic equipment. Patients were told to bring their own gloves and gauze to operations, if they could find any. Infant mortality spiked. Treatable conditions became death sentences. Venezuelan doctors describe having patients die from infections that could have been cured with a $5 antibiotic. Diabetics died because there was no insulin. Women gave birth by candlelight because the electricity was out. It was like practicing medicine in a war zone, except there was no war, just collapse. The electrical grid failed repeatedly. Caracas, once a gleaming modern city, experienced blackouts lasting days or weeks. Water systems failed without electricity. Refrigeration stopped, spoiling what little food people had. Crime exploded. Venezuela became one of the most violent countries on earth. Kidnappings became routine. Police were often the perpetrators. Their salaries worthless, they turned to crime themselves. And people fled. Over 7 million Venezuelans have left the country since 2014, the largest migration crisis in Latin American history. They walked across borders carrying children and whatever possessions they could manage. They scattered to Colombia, Peru, Chile, Brazil, the United States, Spain. Entire neighborhoods emptied, schools closed for lack of students. Professionals, doctors, engineers, teachers abandoned careers to sell coffee on street corners in Colombia or clean houses in Peru. It was a brain drain of catastrophic proportions. Those who remained faced a daily struggle for survival. Waiting in line for gasoline in an oil-rich country could take 3 days. Finding food required visiting multiple stores, standing in queues for hours, hoping something would be available. Venezuela had become a failed state. Throughout this crisis, the international community, particularly the United States, imposed increasingly severe sanctions on Venezuela. The U.S. first targeted specific Venezuelan officials for corruption and human rights abuses. Then came broader economic sanctions, particularly targeting Venezuela's oil sector and access to international finance. In 2019, the U.S. recognized opposition leader Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate president, rather than Maduro. This created a bizarre situation: 2 men claiming to be president, with different countries recognizing different governments. The sanctions debate is complicated. Political analysts note that sanctions definitely worsened Venezuela's economic situation, particularly for ordinary people. But it's crucial to understand that Venezuela's collapse began before the most severe sanctions. The hyperinflation, the shortages, the exodus, these were already happening because of internal policy failures. Sanctions exacerbated a crisis. They didn't create it. Maduro's government used sanctions as a scapegoat, blaming all of Venezuela's problems on external economic warfare. There is partial truth there. Sanctions did make things harder, but they don't explain why Venezuela's oil production was already collapsing, why domestic manufacturing had already died, why hyperinflation had already started. Those were homegrown failures. The core problem remained. Venezuela had built an economy entirely dependent on oil, mismanaged its oil industry, saved nothing during good years, and responded to crisis by printing money rather than reforming. Sanctions made a bad situation worse, but the situation was already catastrophic. In recent months, tensions between the United States and Venezuela have escalated significantly. Following disputed election results and international concerns about democratic legitimacy, the situation has become increasingly volatile. The U.S. has maintained diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and support for opposition movements. There have been discussions of various forms of intervention: humanitarian corridors, support for democratic transition, increased sanctions, and, in some reports, consideration of more direct involvement. The justifications typically cited for increased pressure include the humanitarian crisis, drug trafficking concerns, regional stability, and democracy promotion. Critics argue that external intervention violates international law and Venezuelan sovereignty and risks making an already dire humanitarian situation even worse.
Any escalation must be understood in this broader context, a country already devastated by economic collapse, with millions of refugees destabilizing neighboring countries, a government that has lost democratic legitimacy in the eyes of much of the international community, and strategic interests including oil reserves and regional influence at stake. The situation remains fluid, with Venezuela caught between internal collapse and external pressure, while ordinary Venezuelans continued to suffer the consequences of both. So why did Venezuela fall so far, so fast? It's tempting to point to a single villain: Chávez's socialism, Maduro's incompetence, U.S. sanctions, corruption, but the truth is more complex. Venezuela combined multiple failures simultaneously. Building 95% of your economy on a single commodity is inherently fragile. When that commodity's price is set by global markets you don't control, you're vulnerable to shocks. This isn't about oil being bad, it's about putting all your eggs in one basket. When oil prices were high, Venezuela spent everything. No sovereign wealth fund, no rainy day reserves, no long-term investment in economic diversification. Compare this to Norway, which saved its oil wealth and today has over $1 trillion in its sovereign wealth fund. Turning PDVSA into a political tool, firing skilled workers, diverting revenues from reinvestment, prioritizing loyalty over competence, destroyed the very engine that powered the economy. Oil production collapsed even before prices fell. Price controls, currency controls, nationalizations, and regulatory uncertainty caused domestic production to collapse. Why would a business produce anything when the government sets prices below the cost of production? Why would anyone invest when property rights are uncertain? When revenue collapsed, the government could have cut spending, eliminated inefficient subsidies, or implemented market reforms. Instead, it printed money, causing hyperinflation that destroyed what remained of the economy. Without strong, independent institutions, courts, central bank, legislature, there were no checks on destructive policies. Corruption flourished, particularly through multiple exchange rates that allowed insiders to siphon billions abroad while ordinary citizens starved. Individually, some of these factors might have been manageable. Together, they created a perfect storm. And here's what makes it tragic: this was preventable. Venezuela and Norway both discovered oil in the 1960s. Both became wealthy. One saved and diversified. One spent and concentrated. Today, Norway ranks among the world's most prosperous countries, with high living standards and a $1 trillion safety net. Venezuela has experienced the largest economic collapse in modern Latin American history. The difference wasn't geography or resources, it was choices. Behind the statistics, the inflation rates, the GDP decline, the migration numbers, are human beings. Children who grew up never knowing stability. Parents who fled their country to find work, leaving children with grandparents. Doctors now driving taxis, engineers selling empanadas, teachers who watched their life savings become worthless overnight. An entire generation has lost their futures to this crisis. Venezuelan mothers describe having had good jobs and children in good schools. They weren't rich, but they were comfortable. Then, in just a few years, everything disappeared. The money became worthless. The stores became empty. Their daughters needed medicine they couldn't find. What could they do? They left. They walked across the border carrying whatever they could, hoping for something better. Anything was better than watching their children go hungry. The refugee crisis has reshaped the entire region. Colombia has absorbed nearly 3 million Venezuelan refugees. Peru, Chile, Ecuador, Brazil all have Venezuelan communities that didn't exist a decade ago. Some have rebuilt their lives. Many struggle in informal economies, vulnerable to exploitation. All carry the trauma of watching their country collapse. Venezuela's collapse offers stark lessons for any country. Resource wealth alone doesn't guarantee prosperity. Management does. Short-term political popularity doesn't build long-term economic sustainability. Institutions matter. Diversification matters. Saving matters.
And when you base your entire economy on something whose price you cannot control, you are always one shock away from catastrophe. Can Venezuela recover? Eventually, yes. The country still has oil reserves, it still has human talent, though millions have left. It has potential for agriculture, tourism, manufacturing, but recovery requires fundamental changes, rebuilding institutions, restoring property rights, controlling inflation, diversifying the economy, investing in infrastructure. Most critically, it requires learning from the mistakes that led to collapse. The tragedy of Venezuela is that it was avoidable. The wealth was real, the potential was real. What failed were the choices: to depend entirely on oil, to prioritize distribution over production, to politicize institutions, to print money instead of reform. Venezuela went from being one of South America's richest countries to among its poorest, not because of bad luck, but because of bad decisions compounded over decades. The question now is whether those lessons will be learned, not just by Venezuela, but by other countries tempted to believe that resource wealth alone can build lasting prosperity. History will remember Venezuela as a cautionary tale, a nation that had everything and lost it all.